Okay, I'm going to shamelessly reformulate the question, because actually it's not so much what as who. Certainly the banks haven't been the biggest casualties, nor has the pre-existing financial system, which seems to be re-entrenching it well. What we're seeing in terms of human rights casualties are very much the same vulnerable groups that were already suffering from social exclusion, marginalisation, in unequal access to goods and services, including, say, women, children, people with disabilities, Indigenous persons, all of whom have been disproportionately impacted upon by the economic crisis, not just by the economic crisis itself, but also the supranational and national responses to the economic crisis. And that's borne out very much in kind of the growing body of data we see, for instance, collected by the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, UNICEF, the World Bank, and there's a whole range of other sources that are making it ever more clear that the people that were already at the edge of things, or that were already excluded, that were already experiencing human rights violations, are now in a worse off position than they were prior to the economic crisis. Well, one would like to feel that if they were human rights centric, unlike the policy responses that we've generally seen, is that they would be focused on rights bearers first and foremost, and that human rights would be a key consideration to be taken into account, rather than simply a bit of lip service that we see once governments have talked about, the important social, economic or other factors that should influence their policies. So essentially what it would result in is, ideally, well, not ideally, but if you were to give effect to human rights effectively, it would lead to policy and law responses that were human-centric, dignity-centric, and that were very much focused upon the most vulnerable, rather than upon prioritising particular institutions or elites, which is what we've seen in terms of the general response from, say, financial institutions or state governments. Well, I think if one was to take austerity and look at it through a human rights lens, it's very clear that there are aspects of it that are completely incompatible with human rights law and human rights standards. The fact that we're seeing in many, many countries, for instance, the UK, the US, Ireland, we're seeing cuts to social programmes which impact upon the most vulnerable, but an explicit decision to preserve tax breaks, for instance, and the recent UK budget highlights that. I think that austerity has given a great opportunity to push forward ideological positions that are contrary to the spirit and purpose of human rights. I think that there are human rights obligations such as non-discrimination, guarantee of this minimum core level of enjoyment of particular rights, specifically, say, housing, food, and social security. If we look at, say, the obligation under international human rights law to prevent retrogressive measures, so step backwards in enjoyment other than in very limited circumstances, and the prioritisation of the most vulnerable, it is very clear that austerity as it stands does not comply with that. And in fact, if you were to take a human rights-based approach, it would have a very different there would be very different priorities accorded both to the needs of particular groups, but also with regards to the action taken, the way in which resources are allocated, and the way in which policies are structured.